The mud of Highgate Cemetery is a living thing on this Christmas Eve, a cold, cloying weight that reminds Detective Inspector Nathaniel Corvus that his left hip is a failed piece of engineering. Highgate at midnight is a landscape of jagged shadows and weeping stone, where the grand monuments of the Victorian dead seem to lean inward as if sharing a secret they are no longer willing to keep. Corvus stands over grave 14 along the Egyptian Avenue, his heavy trench coat soaked through with a freezing drizzle that turns the cemetery paths into slick black ribbons of ice. The headstone, a modest slab of granite dedicated to a merchant who died in 1864, sits undisturbed, but the earth beneath it has erupted in a way that defies every law of physics Corvus has spent 20 years enforcing. It looks like a miniature volcano of silt and gravel, but the pressure didn't come from above. The dirt was exhaled by the planet. Corvus crunches a peppermint lozenge, the sharp medicinal sting of menthol fighting the smell of ancient damp decay and the metallic tang of the London fog. He watches the groundskeeper, a man named Miller, whose lantern shakes so violently that the shadows of the nearby obelisks dance like frantic, elongated ghosts. These are mysteries that challenge your mind and reward attention, Corvus thinks, though the reward tonight feels more like a curse. This story is created by a young creator from USA whose dream is to reach 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy these tales, subscribing helps more than you know, and he thanks you for it. Miller points a trembling finger at the hole, his voice barely a wheeze as he explains that there are more. 29 in total, scattered from here to the Circle of Lebanon, and not a single one was opened by a shovel. Corvus kneels, his shattered hip grinding in its socket, a souvenir from the Westminster Abbey incident that still haunts his dreams with the sound of breaking glass and screaming. He ignores the pain, focusing instead on the lip of the grave. The earth hasn't been dug, it has been clawed. Large clumps of clay are scattered several feet away, thrown with a violent, frantic energy. He reaches into his pocket for a match, strikes it against a dry patch under his lapel, and holds the flickering flame over the dark moor. The coffin lid 6 feet below is visible. It hasn't been pried open. The heavy oak has been splintered from the inside out, the wood jagged and white like the teeth of a predator, pointing toward the sky. A silhouette emerges from the yellow-black soup of the London particular, the thick fog that tastes of coal smoke and bitter river water. Beatrix Halloway doesn't announce her arrival with a greeting. She simply steps into the flickering circle of the groundskeeper's lantern, the sharp scent of eucalyptus and antiseptic trailing behind her like a wake. She wears a man's heavy overcoat over her skirts, her medical bag clutched in a gloved hand. She looks at the hole, then at Corvus, her eyes narrow and analytical. She tells him that the physics of the displacement are impossible, her voice a low, educated rasp. She notes that for wood of this thickness to buckle upward, the internal pressure would have to exceed anything a human body, living or dead, could generate. Corvus asks if she has seen the others. Halloway nods, her jaw set in a hard line. She has been to the Circle of Lebanon, where the subterranean gloom is even more oppressive. She describes graves where the earth was moved aside as if it were water, and coffins that look like they were burst by a localized explosion. But there is no gunpowder, she says, no smell of sulfur, only the scent of old linen and the copper tang of blood that shouldn't be fresh but is. She reaches into her bag and pulls out a silver scalpel, using the tip to lift a shred of fabric caught on a splintered oak plank. It is a piece of a burial shroud, high-quality lace from the mid-century, but it is stained with something dark and viscous. Corvus takes the lantern from the groundskeeper and lowers it further into the pit. The light reveals the underside of the broken lid. There, etched into the dark wood, are long, deep furrows. They aren't the marks of a tool. They are fingernail scratches, dozens of them, some ending in broken bits of keratin and bone embedded in the grain. The victim, if one could call a man dead for 20 years a victim, didn't just leave. He fought his way through the lid and the 6 feet of packed earth above him. Corvus feels a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he felt before the altar at Westminster 2 years ago. This isn't grave robbing. It is an exodus. He stands with effort, his cane sinking into the mud. He asks Halloway about the names. She pulls a damp ledger from her coat, a list she began compiling the moment she arrived. Every single one of the 29 deceased died on December 24th. Different years, different causes, some natural, some suspicious, but they all share a final date. Corvus looks at the list, his mind working like a mechanical loom, weaving the threads of data into a pattern. He mentions the Order of the Midwinter Veil, a name he found whispered in the margins of a transcript from the Black Museum at Scotland Yard. They were necromancers, or at least they pretended to be, obsessed with the idea that those who die on the eve of Christ's birth are caught in a liminal state, neither fully claimed by heaven nor entirely severed from the older. Darker powers that ruled the British Isles before the first stone of a church was ever laid. The groundskeeper whimpers, claiming he saw something moving near the catacombs, something tall and grey that didn't walk so much as it flowed through the fog. Corvus tells the man to go to the chapel and lock the doors, not because he believes in the protection of the clergy, but because the man's terror is becoming a distraction. Once Miller has scrambled away into the gloom, Corvus turns to Halloway. He asks her if she brought the map. She unfolds a topographical chart of Highgate, the paper damp and fragile. Corvus takes a pencil and begins marking the 29 opened graves. As he connects the dots, the hair on his arms stands up. The marks don't form a circle or a cross. They form a precise, distorted mirror of the constellation Orion, as it appears in the London sky on this very night. The Egyptian Avenue graves represent the belt. The Circle of Lebanon graves form the sword. It is a celestial map etched into the graveyard, a ritual of occult mathematics played out in dirt and bone. Halloway watches him, her breath hitching as she realizes the center of the constellation doesn't hold a grave. It points directly to the entrance of the great catacombs, the labyrinthine tunnels that honeycomb the hill beneath the cemetery. Corvus looks toward the catacombs, where the darkness seems to possess a density that the fog cannot match. He tells Halloway that the bodies aren't just gone, they are converging. The scratch marks on the underside of the lids were the beginning of a journey, not the end of a struggle. They were never meant to rest, he whispers, more to himself than to her. Their burials were a planting. And now, at the stroke of midnight, the harvest has begun. A sound rises from the direction of the catacombs, a rhythmic wet scraping, like a heavy weight being dragged over stone. It is followed by a low vibrating hum that Corvus feels in his teeth. It isn't a voice, but a collective resonance, the sound of 29 pairs of lungs that haven't tasted air in decades, suddenly inhaling the freezing London night. He reaches for his Webley revolver, the cold steel a small comfort against the encroaching dread. He tells Halloway that they need to go down, but she is already ahead of him, her silver scalpel catching a stray glint of gaslight. She reminds him that the boundary between life and death is thinnest on this night, and if the Order has succeeded, what is waiting in the catacombs isn't just the dead, but something ancient that has been waiting for these 29 vessels to finally open. The scraping sound grows louder, more deliberate. It isn't coming from the catacombs anymore, it is coming from the trees behind them and the shadows between the tombstones. Corvus turns, his lantern swinging wide. In the periphery of the light, he sees a hand, pale, shriveled, and caked in fresh earth, reach out from behind a weeping angel statue and grip the cold marble with a strength that makes the stone crack. The first of the 29 has arrived, and it isn't alone. The lantern in Nathaniel Corvus's left hand flickered, the flame struggling against a sudden, unnatural gust that smelled of stagnant water and ancient, undisturbed dust. Behind the weeping angel, the hand didn't claw the air with the frantic desperation of the living buried alive. It gripped the marble with a terrifying, calculated precision. Corvus watched, his thumb hovering over the hammer of his Webley, as a second hand emerged. The fingernails were gone, replaced by jagged, blackened stumps of bone that had worn away through layers of oak and earth. Beatrix Halloway didn't retreat. She stepped closer, the hem of her heavy wool skirts dragging through the sludge, her eyes narrowing as she adjusted her spectacles. She reached into her medical bag, her fingers brushing past vials of laudanum and silver-plated forceps until they found a small, iron-bound compass. The needle didn't point north. It spun in frantic, dizzying circles, humming with a low-frequency vibration that set Corvus's teeth on edge. She noted that the displacement of the soil suggested a strength roughly triple that of a living man in his prime, yet there was no heat coming from the limb. No steam rose from the pale flesh in the freezing December air. The figure finally hauled itself from the shadows of the monument. It was a man, or had been, dressed in the tattered remains of a high-collared Victorian frock coat. His skin was the colour of wet parchment, stretched so tight over the skull that the teeth seemed to be pushing through the cheeks. This wasn't a mindless thrall from a penny dreadful. The creature stood upright, shaking the grave dirt from its shoulders with a rhythmic mechanical twitch. It didn't look at them. Its milky, clouded eyes were fixed on the horizon, that toward the dark silhouette of the great catacombs. Corvus cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the muffled silence of the cemetery. He told the thing to stand fast in the name of the Queen, his voice gravelly and devoid of the tremor that threatened to seize his limbs. The creature paused. It turned its head with a sickening series of wet pops, the vertebrae of its neck protesting the movement. It didn't growl. It spoke, or rather it exhaled a sequence of sounds that mimicked the cadence of human speech without the soul behind it. It whispered a name, Adelaide, and then, with a burst of speed that defied its withered frame, it loped away into the fog, moving with a jerky, spider-like gait toward the Egyptian avenue. Halloway knelt by the disturbed earth, ignoring the mud staining her knees. She pointed toward the hole the man had crawled out of. She remarked that the grave belonged to Thomas Thorne, a clockmaker who died in 1874. He had been a member of the same guild as 3 other men whose graves were found breached earlier that evening. Corvus leaned heavily on his cane, the ache in his shattered hip flaring up like a hot iron. He realized that the Order of the Midwinter Veil hadn't chosen these 29 souls at random. They were selecting craftsmen, scholars, and architects, men who built things, men who understood how systems functioned. They left the cemetery gates behind, the iron bars groaning as the groundskeeper locked them with trembling hands. Corvus and Halloway retreated to his makeshift office above a tea warehouse near the Highgate ponds. The room was a graveyard of its own, filled with stacks of yellowing police reports, jars of peppermint lozenges, and a massive map of London pinned to the wall with red string. Corvus moved to the map, his hands stained with the soot of the cemetery. He began to mark the locations of the 29 graves they had identified from the cemetery registry. As the red lines intersected, a pattern emerged that made Halloway drop her medical bag. It wasn't a simple geometric shape. It was a perfect projection of the Draco constellation as it appeared in the London sky at precisely midnight on Christmas Eve. Corvus traced the lines to the center, his finger landing on the circle of Lebanon. He explained that the ancient Greeks saw Draco as the guardian of the golden apples, a serpent that never slept. The Order didn't want to just wake the dead. They were building a celestial engine out of bone and spirit. The smell of his own stale tobacco smoke felt suffocating. Corvus opened a window, letting in the biting chill and the distant sound of church bells practicing for the midnight mass. He turned to a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a charred ledger, the only thing he had salvaged from the Westminster Abbey incident 2 years prior. In those pages lay the accounts of Lord Malachi Stirling's early experiments. Stirling hadn't always been a necromancer. He had been a grieving father who lost his daughter to a sudden wasting fever on a Christmas morning. Corvus read aloud a passage where Stirling claimed that the grief of 1,000 fathers was enough to tear a hole in the veil, provided one had the right needles to sew it back together. Halloway paced the small room, her boots clicking on the floorboards. She argued that the physics of it were impossible, yet her eyes remained fixed on the compass on the table, which was still spinning. She suggested that if the 29 were converging on the catacombs, they weren't just vessels. They were the components of a ritual circle. Each of them had died on a Christmas Eve, their souls caught in that specific moment of transition. She looked at Corvus, her expression softening for a fraction of a second, and asked him if he truly believed Stirling could bring back the dead. Corvus didn't answer immediately. He reached for a peppermint lozenge, the sharp sweetness a brief distraction from the phantom scent of rotting lilies. He told her that he didn't care what Stirling believed. He cared about what the man was willing to sacrifice to prove it. In Westminster, it had been a dozen choir boys. Here in Highgate, the stakes were the very fabric of the city's peace. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from his shelf, a history of the pre-Christian burial mounds that Highgate was built upon. He pointed to a sketch of a standing stone that had been incorporated into the foundation of the Egyptian avenue. The Order of the Midwinter Veil wasn't just using Victorian occultism. They were tapping into something far older, something that resided in the soil long before the cross was raised in Britain. Corvus explained that the 29 deaths across the years were calculated murders, orchestrated by the Order, to ensure that the souls would be available for this specific night. The corrupt officials who closed those cases weren't just lazy, they were on Sterling's payroll. A sudden rhythmic thumping began at the door downstairs. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something heavy and soft being swung against the wood. Corvus grabbed his revolver, the metal cold against his palm, and signaled for Halloway to stay back. He limped to the landing, peering down the dark stairwell. The thumping stopped, replaced by a wet, sliding sound. Through the mail slot, a piece of folded parchment was pushed into the hallway. Corvus descended the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He retrieved the note and retreated to the light of the office. The paper was high-quality vellum, embossed with the Sterling family crest, but it was damp and smelled of grave dirt. Inside, in an elegant, trembling hand, were the words, "The guest list is complete, Inspector. We only lack a witness to testify to the miracle. Please join us for the midnight feast." Halloway took the note from his hand. Her brow furrowed. She noted that the ink was still wet, but the parchment itself was ancient. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:15. They had 45 minutes before the constellation reached its zenith. Corvus moved to his coat rack, pulling on his heavy wool trench coat and checking the cylinders of his Webley. He knew that if they went back to the cemetery, they were walking into a trap designed decades ago. But the alternative was to sit in this room and watch London wake up to a world where the graves were no longer silent. He turned to Halloway and asked if she was prepared to see things that science couldn't explain. She snapped her medical bag shut and adjusted her spectacles, a grim smile touching her lips. She told him that she had spent her life explaining away the impossible, and she was quite looking forward to the challenge of being proven wrong. As they stepped out into the freezing rain, a carriage waited at the end of the alley. The driver was hunched over, his face hidden by a deep cowl, and the horses stood unnaturally still, their breath not visible in the air. Corvus gripped his cane, his eyes scanning the rooftops. He saw shadows moving against the grey sky, figures leaping from chimney to chimney, with a grace that no living man possessed. The 29 were moving, drawn by a magnetic pull toward the heart of the hill. He realized then that they weren't just going to the catacombs to stop a ritual. They were going there to see if the world they knew still existed, or if the Order had already won. As the carriage began to roll toward Highgate, the wheels silent on the cobblestones, Corvus felt a strange vibration beneath his feet. It wasn't the carriage. It was the earth itself, a low-frequency hum that seemed to be rising from the very foundations of the city. He looked at Halloway, who was staring at her compass. The needle had stopped spinning. It was now pointing directly downward, through the floor of the carriage, toward the dark, hungry depths of the London soil. The first of the bells began to toll for the late-night service, but the sound was distorted, echoing as if it were underwater. Corvus checked his watch. The second hand was moving backward. He leaned back against the leather seat, the peppermint lozenge dissolving on his tongue like a bitter secret. He knew the ritual had already begun, and the 29th grave was not located in the cemetery at all. It was waiting for them, and the name on the headstone was one he had spent 2 years trying to forget. Comment, who you suspect. Can you solve it first? The iron-rimmed wheels of the brougham ground against the frozen ruts of Swain's Lane, a sound like teeth masticating dry bone. Inside the cabin, the air was a stagnant cocktail of peppermint oil and the metallic tang of Corvus's cooling tea. He shifted his weight, and a familiar, jagged bolt of lightning shot from his hip to his knee. He didn't wince. He simply tightened his grip on the silver head of his cane until his knuckles turned the color of the fog pressing against the glass. Across from him, Beatrix Halloway sat with a composure that bordered on the unnatural. She was meticulously cleaning a set of long, slender needles with a piece of silk, her eyes never leaving the blackened window. The London particular had swallowed the city whole, turning the gas lamps into pale, sickly bruises in the yellow-grey murk. Corvus watched the way the light caught the edge of Halloway's spectacles. She hadn't spoken since they left the alleyway, but her silence was heavy, a physical weight that occupied the small space between them. He thought of the vibration he'd felt earlier, that low, thrumming hum that seemed to originate from the very mantle of the earth. It was getting stronger as they climbed the hill toward Highgate, a rhythmic pulsing that vibrated through the soles of his boots and rattled the teeth in his gums. It felt less like a sound and more like a collective heartbeat, thousands of lungs exhaling in a singular subterranean rhythm. The carriage lurched to a halt at the Great South Gate. The horses let out a long, low whinny that sounded far too much like a human moan. Corvus reached for the door handle, but Halloway's hand shot out, catching his wrist. Her skin was startlingly cold, the touch of someone who spent more time with the departed than the living. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the iron bars of the gate. She whispered that the air was changing, shifting from the soot of the city to the sulphur of the deep. She pulled a small, brass vial from her waistcoat and unscrewed the cap, releasing a pungent scent of rosemary and salt. She smeared a drop on her own throat before offering it to him. Corvus waved it away with a sharp flick of his hand. He told her he preferred to smell the devil when he arrived. It saved time on introductions. He stepped out into the biting December air, his boots sinking into a slurry of half-frozen mud and dead leaves. The cemetery loomed before them, a Gothic nightmare of weeping angels and ivy-choked obelisks. The groundskeepers were nowhere to be seen, their lanterns abandoned and guttering on the stone steps. The silence here was absolute, the kind of silence that had weight pressing against the eardrums until they ached. Corvus took a long pull from his flask, the burn of cheap scotch a welcome distraction from the freezing drizzle. He looked up at the silhouette of the Egyptian avenue. The stone lotus columns stood like sentinels guarding the entrance to a world that had forgotten the sun. As they moved deeper into the necropolis, the evidence of the night's abomination became impossible to ignore. Corvus knelt by a fresh mound of earth near the path. The grave hadn't been shoveled out. The soil had been displaced with violent, frantic energy from below. Clumps of dirt were scattered several feet away, as if blasted out by a small explosion. He reached down, his gloved fingers brushing against a splinter of polished mahogany. It was curved outward. The lid of the coffin hadn't been pried off by a crowbar. It had been shattered by a force pressing from the inside. He held the wood up to the dim light of his lantern. On the underside, clear and deep, were the gouges of fingernails, the wood stained with the dark, tacky residue of something that had once been blood. Halloway stood over him, her medical bag clutched to her chest. She pointed her own light toward the trail that led away from the grave. It wasn't a trail of footsteps. It was a wide, dragging furrow in the mud, as if something heavy and uncoordinated had hauled itself along the ground. The trail led straight toward the circle of Lebanon, the massive cedar tree at its heart standing like a gnarled hand, reaching for the throat of the moon. Corvus stood up, his hip screaming in protest. He followed the drag marks, his eyes scanning the shadows between the tombs. He saw movement, a flash of white fabric, a jerk of a limb that didn't follow the laws of anatomy. He didn't draw his revolver yet. He knew lead was a poor argument against the mathematics of the order. They reached the entrance to the Egyptian avenue, the passage narrow and claustrophobic. The air here was warmer, thick with the smell of wet limestone and something sweet, like overripe lilies. The vibration was a roar now, a physical pressure that made his vision blur. Halloway checked her compass again. The needle was no longer pointing down. It was spinning in a frantic, blurred circle, a silver blur in the palm of her hand. She told him the magnetic field was collapsing, that the boundary between the planes was thinning to the point of transparency. She warned him that what they were seeing wasn't just the dead returning. It was the past attempting to overwrite the present. Corvus ignored her, his attention fixed on a specific headstone at the far end of the avenue. It was a modest marker, tucked away in a shadowed alcove where the sun never reached. It was the 29th grave. Unlike the others, this one hadn't been torn open. The earth above it was undisturbed, the frost still clinging to the dead grass in a perfect glittering sheet. But as Corvus approached, the name on the stone began to clarify through the fog. It was a name that had been carved into his heart 2 years ago in the smoking ruins of Westminster Abbey. It was a name he had whispered into the empty air of his apartment every night since. Ilara Corvus. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the cold marble. He remembered the smell of her hair, like rain and lavender. He remembered the way she had looked at him before the explosion, a look of profound, terrifying realization. The Order hadn't just chosen 29 random souls. They had been collecting pieces of a map, and his wife was the final destination. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest, a sensation of being hollowed out from the inside. Halloway stepped up beside him, her face pale in the lantern light. She looked at the headstone and then back at Corvus, her eyes filled with a clinical kind of pity. She told him that she had wondered why the Order had let him live after the Abbey incident. Now she knew. He wasn't the hunter, he was the usher. His grief was the frequency they were using to tune the ritual. He looked at her, his teeth bared in a snarl, and asked her how long she had known. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the base of the headstone. A thin, grey hand was slowly pushing through the frozen earth. It wasn't the frantic clawing of the others. It was a gentle, deliberate movement, as if someone were waking from a long, peaceful sleep. The fingers were long and elegant, the nails perfectly manicured, just as they had been on the day of their wedding. Corvus felt his knees give way. He dropped his cane, the silver head clattering against the stone. He watched, paralyzed, as the hand reached out and gripped the edge of his boot. The ground beneath them began to heave, the massive stone slabs of the Egyptian avenue cracking and tilting like ice on a thawing river. From the darkness of the catacombs ahead, a chorus of voices began to rise, not a scream, but a low, melodic chant in a language that predated the stones of London. The shadows on the walls began to detach themselves, forming figures that wore the tattered remains of Victorian finery. They weren't ghosts. They were solid, heavy, and smelling of the earth. Corvus felt a cold, familiar touch on his ankle. He looked down and saw his wife's face emerging from the mud. Her eyes were open, but they weren't the eyes he remembered. They were voids, reflecting the starless sky above. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, forming a single word that echoed in the chambers of his mind. He realized then that the ritual didn't need 29 bodies to cross over. It only needed one man who was willing to let go of the world to hold on to a ghost. The vibration stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of an empty house. Corvus looked up and saw Lord Malachi Stirling standing at the end of the avenue, his hands folded neatly in front of his velvet coat. He smiled, an expression of genuine, heartbreaking sympathy. He told Corvus that the gate was open, and all he had to do was step through. Behind Stirling, the darkness of the catacombs began to glow with a pale subterranean light, revealing a shape that was far too large to be human, a mass of shifting shadows and ancient hunger, waiting for the final vessel to be filled. Comment: who you suspect. Can you solve it first? The weight of the hand on Nathaniel Corvus's boot was more than just physical. It was a gravitational pull from a past he had tried to bury beneath layers of peppermint lozenges and the relentless grinding work of the yard. The mud of Highgate was a thick, gluttonous soup, and as the fingers of his long-lost Clara tightened around his leather footwear, the metal of his hip joint screamed in protest. He did not move. He could not move. The silver head of his cane lay discarded in the muck, reflecting the sickly, sulphurous glow of a distant gas lamp, like a dying star. Lord Malachi Stirling stood at the edge of the shadows, his voice a velvet caress that cut through the freezing drizzle. He told Nathaniel that grief was merely a shadow cast by the light of a soul that refused to move on, and that tonight, the shadow and the light would finally become one. Nathaniel's breath hitched, the cold air burning his lungs as he looked into the hollow voids that were once his wife's eyes. There was no recognition there, only a vast subterranean emptiness that seemed to echo with the sound of 1,000 shifting stones. He wanted to believe the lie Malachi was selling. He wanted to reach down, to pull her from the freezing earth, and tell her that the Westminster Abbey incident had been a fever dream, that the years of searching had been for nothing, because she was here, now, in his arms. But the smell of her was wrong. She didn't smell of the lavender water she used to favor. She smelled of wet limestone, of the stagnant water that gathered in the bottom of a lead-lined coffin, and of the deep, indifferent cold of the London clay. A sharp, rhythmic clicking sound broke the spell. It was the sound of iron-shod boots on stone, moving with a clinical, purposeful speed. Beatrix Halloway emerged from the fog, her medical bag swinging at her side like a pendulum. She didn't hesitate, she didn't scream. She reached into her coat and withdrew a heavy glass vial filled with a shimmering, iridescent powder, grinded sea salt, mixed with filings of refined silver. With a flick of her wrist, she sprayed the contents in a wide arc around Nathaniel, the powder hissing as it touched the disturbed earth. The hand on Nathaniel's boot recoiled as if scorched by a brand. The melodic chanting from the catacombs twisted into a dissonant shriek that rattled the iron railings of the Egyptian avenue. Beatrix grabbed Nathaniel by the shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her slight stature. She told him to get up, her voice a sharp blade of reality cutting through the necrotizing fog of his emotions. She warned him that the man standing before them wasn't a grieving father, but a scavenger, picking at the scabs of the city's soul. Nathaniel felt the fog in his mind clear, replaced by the familiar dull ache of his hip and the sharp peppermint sting of a lozenge he had tucked into his cheek hours ago. He reached for his cane, his fingers trembling as he gripped the silver handle. Lord Malachi Stirling didn't move as they retreated. He merely watched them with a look of profound, tragic disappointment. He called out to Nathaniel, telling him that the clock was already ticking toward the midnight hour, and that the 29 were not a sacrifice but a welcoming committee. The shadows behind him seemed to swell, the stone lotus-headed columns of the avenue bowing under the weight of an invisible pressure. As Nathaniel and Beatrix hurried toward the cemetery's western gate, the rhythmic tink-tink of ice on the iron gates seemed to speed up, matching the frantic beating of Nathaniel's heart. They found sanctuary in the sexton's office, a cramped, circular room filled with the smell of old paper and the comforting heat of a coal-fired stove. Nathaniel collapsed into a wooden chair, his leg throbbing with a rhythmic intensity that matched the tolling of the chapel bell outside. Beatrix didn't offer him comfort. She offered him a map. She spread a detailed plan of Highgate Cemetery across the scarred mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the locations of the 29 desecrated graves. She pointed out that the graves didn't just form a constellation in the sky, they formed a circuit on the ground. The earth had been moved in a specific sequence, a ritualistic unearthing that followed the flow of the subterranean springs that ran beneath the hill. Nathaniel stared at the map, his mind working through the occult mathematics Malachi had mentioned. He realized that the graves weren't just random choices. Each of the 29 people buried there had died on a Christmas Eve. Yes, but there was a deeper thread. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket, flipping through the names he had painstakingly recorded from the headstones. He noticed a pattern that made the peppermint taste like ash in his mouth. Each victim had been a person of significance in the history of the London Underground, not the criminals, but the keepers. One had been a tunnel engineer for the burgeoning Metropolitan line, another had been a guardian of the city's ancient sewers, a third had been a clerk in the office of the Great Seal. He explained to Beatrix that these weren't just souls, they were keys. The Order of the Midwinter Veil wasn't just trying to bring the dead back to life, they were using the dead to map a path into the foundations of London itself. The city was built on layers of history, each one burying the secrets of the one before it. The catacombs beneath Highgate were just the entrance to a much older, much darker network of tunnels that predated the Romans, a place where the barrier between the world of the living and the ancient hunger Malachi worshipped was at its thinnest. The window of the sexton's office rattled in its frame as a gust of wind howled through the cemetery, carrying with it the faint rhythmic scratching of fingernails on wood. Nathaniel looked at the map again, his eyes narrowing as he traced the final line of the constellation. The pattern was incomplete. It required one more point to close the circuit, a 30th grave that sat at the very center of the Circle of Lebanon. He checked his notes, his heart skipping a beat as he looked for the name associated with that central plot. The space was marked as reserved, a perpetual lease held by a private trust since 1887. Beatrix leaned over the desk, her brow furrowing as she read the name on the lease. She looked at Nathaniel, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing dread. She asked him if he recognized the name of the trust. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph he carried in his vest. A picture of his wife, Clara, taken on their last Christmas together. On the back of the photo, written in a delicate, flowing hand, was the name of the very trust that held the lease on the central grave in the Circle of Lebanon. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The trust wasn't a legal entity, it was a legacy. It had been established in his name, funded by an anonymous donor 2 years prior, right after the Westminster Abbey incident. He had been meant to find this. He had been groomed for this moment from the very beginning. The 29 dead weren't rising for Malachi Sterling, they were rising for him. They were the honor guard for a king who didn't know he had been crowned. Outside, the chapel bell stopped tolling, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a weight on the eardrums. Nathaniel stood up, his hip clicking loudly in the quiet room. He told Beatrix that they had to go back, not to stop the ritual but to find out who had signed the trust documents. If he could find the hand that held the pen, he could find the heart of the order. But as he reached for the door, he saw a shadow move across the frosted glass. It wasn't the shadow of a man. It was the silhouette of something with too many limbs, something that moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. The door began to groan, the wood splintering inward as if under the pressure of a rising tide. Nathaniel drew his revolver, the cold steel a comfort in his hand. But he knew that bullets were a poor defense against the things that lived in the liminal spaces between life and death. He looked at Beatrix, seeing for the first time a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. He told her to stay behind him, but even as he said it, the floorboards beneath their feet began to heave. The earth was rising again, and this time it wasn't coming for his boots. It was coming for the room itself. As the first of the heavy stone slabs of the floor cracked open, a smell filled the office that made Nathaniel's stomach turn. The smell of 1,000 Christmas dinners left to rot in a cellar. From the darkness beneath the floorboards, a voice whispered his name. It wasn't Malachi's velvet tones, and it wasn't Clara's ghostly echo. It was a voice he recognized from his own nightmares, the voice of the man he had thought he killed beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey 2 years ago. The dead weren't just rising, they were bringing his failures back to finish what they started. Comment who you suspect, can you solve it first? The floorboards didn't just snap, they shrieked, a sound of tortured oak that mimicked a human cry. Nathaniel Corvus didn't hesitate. He lunged across the buckling room, his fingers clawing into the thick wool of Beatrix Halloway's sleeve, hauling her back toward the window as the center of the office dissolved into a jagged crater of splinters and black, churned earth. The hip injury, his constant thrumming companion, flared into a white-hot spike of agony that felt like a hot needle being driven into his marrow. He gritted his teeth, the taste of a crushed peppermint lozenge sharp and medicinal on his tongue, and braced himself against a heavy mahogany desk that was already beginning to tilt into the abyss. From the darkness of the hole, the smell of the London sewers mingled with something far older, the cloying metallic scent of a battlefield left to the crows. And then came the voice. It was a wet, rattling sound, as if the speaker were trying to talk through a throat filled with river silt. It called his name again, dragging out the syllables of Nathaniel until they sounded like a curse. The shadow on the frosted glass of the office door shifted, elongating, its many-limbed silhouette dancing in the flickering orange light of the dying hearth. The hand that gripped the edge of the broken floor was the color of a bruised plum, the skin translucent and stretched so tight over the knuckles that the bone threatened to burst through. Corvus knew that hand. He had seen it 2 years ago, reaching out from the scaffolding beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey. He had watched Arthur Penhaligon fall into the darkness of the foundation pits, and he had heard the wet thud that followed. The inquest had called it a tragic accident, a lapse in safety during the restoration, but Nathaniel had seen the way the shadows had seemed to pull the man down. Now, Penhaligon was climbing out of a hole in a solicitor's office 5 miles away, and he wasn't alone. Beatrix didn't scream. Her training as a physician, however disgraced, held her steady. She reached into the heavy leather bag at her hip and pulled out a handful of coarse grey powder. With a flick of her wrist, she scattered it in a wide arc between them and the rising thing. The powder didn't settle like dust. It hung in the humid air, glowing with a faint, sickly phosphorescence. that seemed to repel the encroaching shadows. She told Nathaniel to get to the window, her voice steady, but pitched an octave higher than usual, a thin wire of tension vibrating beneath her clinical exterior. As the creature's head cleared the floor, Nathaniel saw the eyes. They weren't the eyes of a dead man. They were twin points of pale, milky light, devoid of pupils, reflecting a hunger that had nothing to do with the stomach. The jaw hung slack, the beard matted with the same black earth that filled the graves at Highgate. This wasn't a resurrection of the soul, it was a reanimation of the grievance. The Order of the Midwinter Veil didn't just want the dead to walk, they wanted the dead to settle the debts of the living. Nathaniel drew his Webley revolver, the cold steel a heavy, grounding weight in his palm. He aimed at the center of the thing's forehead, but his hand trembled, not with fear but with the realization of the mathematics. If Penhaligon was here, then the 29 graves weren't just a collection of strangers, they were a ledger. He fired, the report of the gun deafening in the enclosed space, filling the room with the acrid, biting stench of cordite. The bullet struck the creature squarely, but there was no spray of blood, no recoil. The lead simply vanished into the soft, rotten tissue like a stone dropped into a pond. The thing that used to be Arthur Penhaligon pulled itself further onto the floor, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being operated by a drunkard. Behind it, more fingers appeared at the edge of the crater. The 29 were converging, and they weren't starting at the cemetery. They were starting with the man who had failed to keep them in the ground. Comment who you suspect. Can you solve it first? Beatrix grabbed Nathaniel's coat, her strength surprising him as she shoved him toward the window. The glass shattered outward under the weight of his shoulder, and they tumbled into the narrow, rain-slicked alleyway behind the building. The London fog swallowed them instantly, a yellow-grey shroud that tasted of sulphur and coal smoke. Nathaniel landed hard on his bad side, the impact sending a jolt of electricity through his spine that left him gasping for breath, his vision swimming in a sea of grey. They didn't stop to look back. The sound of the office being torn apart followed them, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy, dead feet hitting the pavement. They ran through the labyrinth of the rookeries, the narrow streets of East London providing a maze of filth and shadow. Nathaniel's breath came in ragged hitches, each step a battle against the structural failure of his own body. He could feel the cold dampness of the fog seeping into his lungs, a heavy weight that made every heartbeat feel like a labor of will. When they finally collapsed into the shadows of a recessed doorway near Lincoln's Inn Fields, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. The city felt empty, as if the London particular had erased everyone but the hunter and the hunted. Beatrix leaned against the soot-stained brick, her chest heaving, her men's trousers torn at the knee. She looked at Nathaniel, her eyes sharp and searching in the gloom. She asked him why that man called his name. She asked him what really happened in the Abbey. Nathaniel couldn't look at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tin of peppermints, his fingers fumbling with the lid. He explained that the 29 deaths weren't just a pattern on a map. They were a list of every case he had closed in the last 10 years, where the perpetrator was never found or the victim's body was never recovered. Penhaligon was the first. The others, the girl from the Thames, the clerk from the Mint, the widow from Blackheath, they were all part of the constellation. The Order hadn't chosen the bodies at random. They had harvested his failures. The realization was a cold stone in his gut. Lord Malachi Stirling wasn't just conducting a ritual to bring back his daughter. He was building a court of the wronged to sit in judgment, and Nathaniel Corvus was the one on trial. The trust documents they had been searching for weren't just legal papers. They were the contracts of the Order, signed in the blood of the desperate. He told Beatrix that they had to get to the London Metropolitan Archives. If the names in the graves were his cases, then the 29th grave, the one at the very center of the Circle of Lebanon, belonged to someone he hadn't lost yet. It belonged to the person the Order needed to complete the circle, the one whose death would bridge the gap between the living and the ancient hunger waiting beneath the hill. They moved through the fog like ghosts, the rhythmic clatter of a distant hansom cab, the only sign that the world still existed. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every dripping pipe sounding like the footfall of a dead man. When they reached the heavy iron doors of the archives, the locks had already been melted away. The metal twisted as if by a great heat. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of dust and decaying paper, a sharp contrast to the damp rot of the streets. In the center of the main hall, beneath the high, domed ceiling, a single gas lamp flickered. Beneath it sat a man in a fine wool coat, his hands folded neatly on a stack of ledgers. Lord Malachi Stirling looked up, his face pale and etched with a grief so profound it transcended madness. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. He smiled, a thin, trembling line, and told Nathaniel that he was just in time to read the final entry. Nathaniel stepped forward, his revolver raised, but his eyes were drawn to the ledger on the table. The ink was still wet, the script elegant and precise. He saw the names of the 28, their dates of death, their locations in Highgate, and then he saw the 29th name. It wasn't his own. It was a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years, a name that belonged to a woman who had vanished on a snowy Christmas Eve without a single trace. The realization hit him harder than the fall in the alley. The Order hadn't just been watching his cases, they had been orchestrating his life. The 29 graves weren't just about the dead rising. They were about the one person Nathaniel Corvus would do anything to bring back, and the price the Order was about to demand for her return. As the heavy doors of the archives slammed shut of their own accord, the darkness rushed in, and Nathaniel realized that the most dangerous thing in Highgate wasn't what was coming out of the graves, but what he was willing to do to see her face one last time. The ink on the ledger seemed to pulse like a fresh wound, the name Elena Corvus staring back at Nathaniel with a cruel, silent intensity. For 5 years, he had lived in the grey spaces of London, a man haunted by a disappearance that had no logic, no footprint, and no closure. He felt the familiar, grinding ache in his shattered hip, a reminder of the Westminster Abbey incident, but it was eclipsed by a hollow coldness that radiated from his chest. Lord Malachi Stirling remained seated, his posture almost catatonic, his manicured fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if he were afraid the paper might breathe. The archive room, usually a sanctuary of dead facts and dusty records, felt like the interior of a ribcage, the air growing thinner and smelling of old vinegar and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching storm. Nathaniel didn't lower his revolver, but his hand lacked its usual stony steadiness. He looked at Stirling, seeing not a mastermind, but a man who had completely surrendered to the gravity of his own sorrow. Stirling spoke with a voice that sounded like dry parchment being folded, explaining that the world was built on a series of layers, and that the boundary between what was and what could be was never thinner than on the night of the winter solstice. He told Nathaniel that the Order of the Midwinter Veil did not seek to break the laws of God, but to fulfill the older, neglected laws of the earth. He claimed that Eleanor had not been taken but called, and that her presence in the 29th grave was the final keystone in a bridge that had been centuries in the making. Beatrix Halloway stepped into the light of the single gas lamp, her medical bag clutched tightly, her eyes scanning the room with a clinical detachment that Nathaniel knew was a mask for her own rising dread. She noted the way the dust on the floor was swirling in patterns that defied the draft from the broken door. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against silver scalpels and jars of salt, and told Stirling that necromancy was merely the ultimate failure of the imagination, a refusal to accept the finality of the pulse. Her voice was steady, but Nathaniel saw her jaw tighten as she looked at the names in the ledger. She was a woman of science who had spent her life dissecting the spiritual, yet even she seemed to falter in the presence of Stirling's absolute quiet conviction. Stirling didn't argue. He simply stood up, his wool coat hanging heavy on his thin frame, and gestured toward the door. He told them that the convergence had already begun, and that if they wished to see the resolution of the mathematics they had been tracking, they must return to the heart of the hill. He walked past them, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, exuding a sense of purpose that made Nathaniel's blood feel like slush. Nathaniel followed, his heavy, dragging gait echoing through the hollow archives, his mind a storm of conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to put a bullet in Stirling's head and end the ritual there, but the detective in him, the man who needed to know the truth, demanded that he see the 29th grave for himself. As they stepped back out into the night, The London particular had thickened into something almost solid. The fog didn't just obscure the cemetery, it seemed to swallow the light from their lanterns, turning the world into a series of disconnected, flickering moments. The smell of wet limestone and coal smoke was gone, replaced by the overwhelming, cloying scent of lilies and freshly turned soil. The rhythmic tink-tink of ice on the iron railings had ceased, replaced by a low, subterranean vibration that Nathaniel felt in his teeth. It was a sound like a great engine turning over deep within the earth, or perhaps the collective breathing of 29 sets of lungs that had forgotten how to draw air. They moved toward the Egyptian avenue, the towering stone pylons and lotus-headed columns looming out of the mist like the guardians of a forgotten world. The path was slick with a black, oily substance that shouldn't have been there, and Nathaniel noticed that the ivy clinging to the tombs was twitching, the leaves uncurling as if it was spring instead of the dead of winter. Beatrix walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his arm to keep her bearings. She whispered that the atmospheric pressure was dropping in a way that should be impossible, her scientific mind struggling to categorize the sensory assault of the cemetery. She said that the air felt charged, as if they were standing inside a massive Leyden jar, waiting for the spark that would discharge the built-up energy. If this story has gripped you, hit the like button. It helps reach more people who would love this. As they approached the Circle of Lebanon, the subterranean gloom seemed to intensify. The ancient cedar tree at the center of the circle looked like a skeletal hand reaching for a sky it could no longer see. Nathaniel's lantern light caught the edge of a shattered coffin lid lying on the path, the wood splintered outward as if by a tremendous internal pressure. He saw the nail scratches on the underside, deep grooves that spoke of a frantic, mindless desperation. He thought of Eleanor, of her laughter and the way she smelled of lavender and rain, and he tried to reconcile that image with the horror Sterling was describing. He wondered if she had been waiting in the dark all these years, trapped in that liminal space between redemption and the older powers of the earth. Sterling stopped at the entrance to the subterranean catacombs that honeycombed the hill. He pointed toward a specific alcove, one that had been sealed with a plain, unmarked stone for as long as Nathaniel could remember. He said that the 29 were not just bodies, but vessels for a consciousness that predated the City of London itself. He explained that the ritual required 29 souls who had died on Christmas Eve, because that was the moment when the light was reborn and the shadows were at their most vulnerable. He claimed that the order was merely facilitating a homecoming, a return of a power that had been buried when the first stones of the Highgate Chapel were laid. Nathaniel stepped forward, his lantern held high, the light reflecting off the damp walls of the catacomb. He saw the markings on the floor, the occult mathematics he had recognized earlier, now glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. The lines formed a constellation that mirrored the winter sky, but the stars were out of alignment, shifted toward a dark center that hadn't existed when the maps were drawn. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his hip, a flare of agony that forced him to lean against the cold stone wall. He realized then that the pain wasn't just physical, it was a resonance, a connection to the very thing they were approaching. Beatrix knelt by the unmarked stone, her fingers tracing the seam where the mortar had been cracked. She looked up at Nathaniel, her face pale in the lantern light, and said that the stone hadn't been moved from the outside. The cracks were consistent with a force pushing from within, a slow, steady expansion that had taken years to reach its breaking point. She opened her bag and produced a small silver compass, the needle spinning wildly in a circle, unable to find north. She said that the magnetic field in this specific spot was being warped by something high density and high energy, something that shouldn't exist in a place of rest. Sterling stood behind them, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the catacomb ceiling. He told Nathaniel that the time for hesitation was over and that the final hour was approaching. He asked Nathaniel if he was prepared to see what lay behind the stone, or if he would prefer to live the rest of his life in the comfort of a lie. Nathaniel didn't answer. He took his heavy service revolver and used the butt of the weapon to strike the cracked mortar, the sound echoing through the subterranean tunnels like a gunshot. The stone groaned, a deep, grinding sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of Highgate. With a final, desperate shove, the stone gave way, falling backward into the dark recess of the tomb. Nathaniel stepped into the small chamber, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air inside was freezing, far colder than the winter night outside, and it smelled of the same lavender and rain that had haunted his dreams for 5 years. He lowered his lantern, the light sweeping across the floor of the tomb, and there, resting on a bed of disturbed earth, was a shroud that appeared as fresh as the day it had been woven. But it was the sight of the shroud that made Nathaniel's blood turn to ice. It wasn't lying flat as a shroud should. It was draped over a form that was sitting upright, the fabric clinging to a shape that was undeniably, impossibly human. As the light hit the figure, the head began to turn with a slow, mechanical precision, the sound of stiffened fabric rubbing against bone filling the silence of the tomb. Nathaniel froze, his finger tightening on the trigger of his revolver as the shroud began to slip away, revealing a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. The eyes that opened to meet his were not the eyes of the woman he had lost. They were two voids of absolute, consuming blackness that seemed to pull the light from the very room. The figure opened its mouth, but instead of a voice, a sound like 1,000 whispers began to emanate from the shadows. And Nathaniel realized with a jolt of pure terror that the 29th grave was not a resting place, but a doorway that was now standing wide open. The lantern light didn't just illuminate the tomb, it seemed to be swallowed by the figure sitting before Nathaniel Corvus. He watched, rooted by a primal terror that bypassed his analytical mind, as the shroud fell away in slow, rhythmic folds. The woman who bore the face of his long-lost Clara didn't breathe. There was no rise and fall of a chest, no misting of the freezing air from her lips. Only the blackness of her eyes, 2 ink blots in a porcelain mask, held him captive. Nathaniel felt the weight of his service revolver, usually a comfort, become a leaden anchor in his hand. His thumb traced the hammer, but his muscles refused to obey the command to cock the weapon. Beatrix Halloway stepped forward, her boots crunching on the fallen mortar with a sound that felt like bone breaking. She didn't recoil. Instead, she reached into the leather depths of her medical bag, her fingers finding a small glass vial filled with a grey mercuric liquid. She looked at the thing that wore Clara's face with a clinical, almost predatory intensity. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the thick, oppressive silence, "look at the hands. Not the face. Look at the hands." Nathaniel forced his gaze downward. The figure's hands were resting on its knees. They weren't the hands of a woman who had been buried for 5 years. They were raw, the skin scrubbed away to reveal dark, corded muscle and white bone at the fingertips, as if she had spent an eternity clawing through granite. There was no blood, only a dark, viscous sap that oozed from the wounds. This wasn't Clara returned from the Veil. This was a construction, a vessel built from the memory of his grief and the cold reality of the earth. The figure opened its mouth. The sound that emerged wasn't a voice, but the collective resonance of 1,000 distant echoes, like the wind howling through a graveyard of empty bottles. It spoke a name, but it didn't use Clara's voice. It used the voice of every person Nathaniel had ever failed to save. The peppermint lozenge in his mouth turned to ash, the sweetness replaced by the metallic tang of old copper. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his hip, the old Westminster injury flaring up, as if the very presence of this abomination was rewriting his history with agony. "Lord Stirling's design is more elegant than I anticipated," Beatrix murmured, stepping closer to the creature. She uncorked the vial, and the scent of ozone filled the cramped chamber. "She isn't the 29th soul, Nathaniel. She is the 29th gear. Look at the pattern on the floor." Nathaniel lowered the lantern, his hand shaking so violently the shadows danced in a frenzied waltz. Beneath the shroud, carved into the very floor of the tomb, were lines that didn't belong to any Victorian architecture. They were deep, jagged grooves filled with the same dark sap that leaked from the creature's fingers. They formed a geometric web that connected the base of the stone plinth to the walls, disappearing into the cracks Nathaniel had just opened. He realized then that the 29 graves weren't just a constellation in the sky. They were the anchor points of a massive underground machine, and Highgate was the engine. The creature's head tilted further, a sickening crack echoing through the vault as the vertebrae groaned. It began to stand, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible, clumsy strings. Nathaniel finally found the strength to move, stepping back and pulling Beatrix with him toward the narrow exit. "We have to leave," he hissed, his voice cracking. "This isn't a murder investigation anymore, Beatrix. This is a harvest." As they backed out into the Egyptian Avenue, the London fog seemed to have curdled, becoming a thick yellow soup that tasted of sulphur and wet wool. The silence Nathaniel so feared had returned, but it wasn't absolute. Beneath the ground, a rhythmic thrumming had begun, a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth and made the iron railings of the cemetery hum like tuning forks. He looked down the long, shadowed corridor of tombs and saw them. They were emerging from the mist like pale ghosts, but their movements were too heavy, too purposeful. Shrouded figures, their burial silk stained with the black earth, were walking with a synchronized gait toward the center of the cemetery. The 28 others. They didn't look left or right. They didn't see the detective or the physician. They were drawn by a magnetic pull that Nathaniel could almost feel in the marrow of his bones. Each one of them carried the same black void eyes, the same raw, ruined hands. Beatrix gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his wool coat. "The Order isn't just bringing them back," she whispered, her breath a white plume in the dark. "They are using them to carry something. Look at their chests, Nathaniel. Look at how they carry themselves." He squinted through the gloom. Each of the reanimated dead was hunched over, their arms crossed over their midsections as if protecting a precious cargo. As one of the figures passed under a flickering gas lamp near the entrance to the Circle of Lebanon, Nathaniel saw the truth. Their chest cavities had been opened and crudely stitched back together with silver wire. Inside, a soft, rhythmic glow pulsed through the gaps in the fabric, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the human body. They are carrying the fragments of the ancient thing, Nathaniel realized, the horror finally crystallizing in his mind. Lord Stirling didn't just want his daughter back. He wanted to rebuild the god that died before the first stone of London was laid. 29 pieces for 29 vessels. The creature from the tomb, the one wearing Clara's face, stepped out into the avenue behind them. It didn't join the procession immediately. It stopped, its head twitching as it looked at Nathaniel. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the black voids in its eyes seemed to flicker, and a spark of genuine Clara looked out at him, a silent scream for release, for the mercy of a second death. Then the void returned and it turned away, following the others toward the great cedar at the heart of the Circle of Lebanon. Nathaniel's hand went to his pocket, fumbling for his tobacco, but he found only the cold, hard edges of a silver crucifix he hadn't touched since the day Clara disappeared. He didn't believe in its power, but he held it like a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood. "We can't stop 29 of them," Nathaniel said, watching the procession disappear into the fog, not with a revolver and a scalpel. Beatrix turned to him, her face a mask of grim determination. "We don't have to stop all of them. A machine with 29 gears fails if even one is removed. We don't need to save the world, Inspector. We just need to break the cycle." She pointed toward the Circle of Lebanon, where the thrumming was loudest. The sound was no longer just a vibration. It had become a chant, a low, guttural drone that seemed to rise from the very stones. It was the sound of the Order of the Midwinter Veil beginning their final incantation. Above them, the clouds parted for a brief moment, revealing the winter stars, aligned exactly as they had been in the occult mathematics of the graves. As they began to follow the procession, Nathaniel felt a sudden, sharp tug at his coat. He spun around. Revolver raised, but there was no one there, only a scrap of fabric caught on a rusted iron gate. It was a piece of Clara's favorite blue silk scarf, the one she had been wearing the night she vanished. It wasn't old or rotted. It was clean, smelling of lavender and the crisp winter air of 5 years ago. He stared at it, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The Order hadn't just taken her body. They had been keeping her, or something of her, in a state of living death waiting for this specific Christmas Eve. The hunt was no longer about justice or the law. It was a rescue mission into the heart of a nightmare. Nathaniel tucked the scrap of silk into his breast pocket, right over his heart. The dragging pain in his hip seemed to vanish. replaced by a cold surgical fury. He looked at Beatrix and nodded. "Let's go find the man who thinks he can play with the dead." They moved into the circle of Lebanon, the architecture of death closing in around them. The monuments here were grander, more arrogant, as if the wealthy Victorians buried within thought their marble angels could bar the gates of hell. But as Nathaniel and Beatrix reached the inner ring, they saw that the angels had been defaced. The stone faces had been chiseled away, replaced by the same sightless black voids they had seen in the eyes of the risen. At the center of the circle stood the great cedar, its ancient branches heavy with ice and shadow. Beneath its boughs, Lord Malachi Stirling stood, his hands raised toward the star-streaked sky. He was surrounded by the 29 vessels, who were kneeling in a perfect circle, their foreheads touching the frozen earth. The thrumming reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground began to crack, not with the force of an earthquake, but with the precision of a key turning in a lock. Stirling's voice rose above the drone, a high, thin sound filled with a terrifying ecstasy. "The hour of the liminal soul is upon us. The vessels are full. The god of the Winter Veil demands his throne." Nathaniel stepped into the light of the torches the Order had planted around the circle. His revolver was steady now, aimed directly at Stirling's heart. "The investigation is over, my lord," he shouted, the words feeling small against the roaring of the ritual. "Tell them to lie back down, or I'll give you a grave of your own." Stirling didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He merely smiled, a slow, tragic expression that made Nathaniel's skin crawl. "You think you're the hunter, Inspector?" he asked, his voice echoing from the mouths of all 29 corpses simultaneously. "You've been the final ingredient since the moment you stepped into this cemetery. Why do you think your wife waited for you?" As Stirling spoke, the ground beneath Nathaniel began to glow with a sickly, subterranean light, and he realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't standing on solid earth, but on the capstone of a chamber that had remained sealed for 1,000 years. And the weight of his presence was the final trigger the mechanism required. The weight of the stone slab beneath Nathaniel's boots shifted with a groan that felt less like masonry and more like a tectonic sigh. He adjusted his stance, his shattered hip flaring in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse that matched the thrumming vibration rising from the earth. The peppermint lozenge in his mouth had dissolved into a sharp, medicinal sliver, the cooling sensation in his throat, the only thing keeping him from succumbing to the suffocating scent of ozone and wet limestone. Around them, the circle of Lebanon seemed to shrink, the towering cedar tree above casting shadows that moved independently of the flickering torches. The 29 vessels remained frozen in their grotesque, synchronized genuflection, their foreheads pressed against the frosted mud, forming a human perimeter that felt like a biological wall. Lord Malachi Stirling didn't move. He stood with his back to Nathaniel, his silhouette framed by the freezing London fog, looking like a high priest of some forgotten subterranean religion. When he spoke again, his voice was a soft, melodic tremor that cut through the low-frequency hum of the ritual. He told Nathaniel that grief was not a burden, but a blueprint. He explained that the 29 graves were not merely chosen for their dates, but for the specific frequency of the sorrow they contained. Each soul taken on Christmas Eve left a specific kind of hole in the world, a vacuum that the Order of the Midwinter Veil had spent decades learning to harness. Beatrix Halloway moved with a calculated surgical precision, her boots crunching softly on the rime-covered gravel. She didn't look at Stirling. Her eyes were fixed on the perimeter of kneeling corpses. She reached into her medical bag, her fingers brushing against silver instruments that clattered like dry bones. She whispered to Nathaniel that the air was ionizing, the pressure differential between the surface and the catacombs below, creating a vacuum that would eventually collapse the very ground they stood upon. Her voice was steady, the professional detachment of a woman who had spent more time with the dead than the living. Yet Nathaniel saw the slight tremor in her hand as she pulled out a heavy glass vial filled with a swirling mercurial liquid. Stirling finally turned, his face illuminated by the sickly subterranean glow emanating from the cracks in the capstan. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out until they were nothing but bottomless black pits reflecting the winter stars. He asked Nathaniel if he remembered the exact smell of the air the night Sarah vanished. He described it with an intimate, terrifying accuracy: the scent of burning pine, the metallic tang of an approaching storm, and the faint, sweet aroma of lilies. Nathaniel felt the world tilt, his finger tightening on the trigger of his revolver until the iron bit into his skin. He told Sterling to shut his mouth, but the sound was swallowed by the rising drone, a sound that was no longer a vibration, but a physical weight pressing against his chest. The capstone beneath Nathaniel's feet gave a violent lurch, the ancient mechanism below finally succumbing to the weight of the final ingredient. Dust and grit puffed up from the seams, smelling of 1,000 years of stagnant air and something deeper, something mineral and ancient. Sterling laughed, a sound of genuine tragic relief. He told Nathaniel that the detective's wife hadn't been a victim of the ritual, but the catalyst for its perfection. She had seen the veil, he claimed, and she had chosen to step through it so that Nathaniel would eventually follow. The investigation, the Westminster Abbey incident, the years of obsessive searching, it had all been a breadcrumb trail designed to lead the finest mind in London to this specific patch of cursed earth on this specific holy night. Beatrix acted then. She didn't scream or fire a weapon. She smashed the mercurial vial against the trunk of the great cedar. A flash of brilliant violet light erupted, followed by a hissing sound as the liquid began to eat through the ice and the ancient bark. The 29 vessels reacted instantly, their heads snapping up in unison. Their eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with the same violet luminescence, their mouths opening to emit a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. The circle began to close, the corpses dragging themselves forward on hands and knees, their movements jerky and arachnid. Nathaniel fired. The gunshot was a thunderclap in the confined space of the circle, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding him. The lead bullet struck the chest of the nearest vessel, a man buried in 1864. But there was no blood, no recoil. The body simply absorbed the impact, the hole in the tattered wool coat revealing nothing but packed black earth and twisting white roots where a heart should have been. He fired again and again, the rhythmic cracks of the revolver punctuating the screams of the rising dead. But they kept coming, a slow-motion tide of rot and silver light. The ground gave way with a final terminal crack. The capstone shattered into a dozen jagged wedges, and Nathaniel felt the terrifying sensation of weightlessness as he plummeted into the dark. He caught a glimpse of Beatrix reaching for him, her face a mask of clinical desperation, before the freezing air of the cemetery was replaced by a humid, heavy heat. He hit the ground hard, the impact jolting his shattered hip with a pain so intense it turned his vision white. He rolled, gasping for air that tasted of copper and wet clay, his hands scrabbling for his revolver in the gloom. Above him, the jagged hole in the ceiling revealed a circle of the winter sky, framed by the silhouettes of the 29 vessels peering down into the pit. They didn't jump. They began to climb, their fingers digging into the ancient masonry of the walls with impossible strength. Sterling's voice drifted down, echoing off the damp walls of the chamber. He thanked Nathaniel for the sacrifice, his voice sounding distant and hollow. He said that the god of the Winter Veil did not require a soul but a witness, someone who could carry the memory of the crossing into the world above, a carrier for the infection of the ancient truth. Nathaniel managed to sit up, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He found his revolver, but the cylinder was jammed with grit. Beside him, Beatrix had landed more gracefully, already striking a match to light a small brass lantern. The light flared to life, pushing back the shadows of a chamber that was far older than the Egyptian avenue above. The walls were lined with rows of alcoves, each containing a figure wrapped in crumbling linen. But these were not Victorians. They were small, stunted things, their skulls elongated. Their rib cages expanded to house something other than human lungs. In the center of the chamber stood a monolithic block of black basalt, etched with the same star map Nathaniel had seen in the pattern of the graves. Resting atop the stone was a single silver music box, its lid open, the mechanism silent. Nathaniel recognized it instantly. It was the gift he had bought for Sarah for their final Christmas together, the one that had disappeared from their bedside table the morning she vanished. As the first of the 29 vessels dropped from the ceiling, landing with a wet thud in the darkness behind them, the music box began to play a distorted, slowed-down version of a Christmas carol. The shadows at the far end of the room began to coalesce, the darkness thickening into a physical shape that didn't just block the light, but seemed to consume it. Nathaniel watched, paralyzed by a mixture of detective's curiosity and primal terror, as a hand reached out from the void to touch the music box. The hand was pale, the skin translucent, and on the ring finger was a gold band that matched the one Nathaniel wore on his own trembling hand. A voice, familiar and beloved, yet sounding as if it were speaking from the bottom of a deep well, whispered his name through the gloom. The 29 vessels fell to their knees in the darkness, and the ancient thing behind the veil began to pull itself into the light of the lantern. Nathaniel Corvus stood frozen, his eyes anchored to the gold band on the woman's finger. It was the same slight, intentional scratch on the inner curve of the ring, a mark he had traced with his thumb during 1,000 quiet evenings in their Bloomsbury flat before the world went dark. The silver music box on the basalt monolith continued its limping, distorted rendition of a Christmas carol, each note sounding like a rusted nail being pulled from a floorboard. The atmosphere in the chamber was heavy, pressing against his lungs with the weight of 100 feet of Highgate soil and 1,000 years of forgotten grief. Beatrix Halloway shifted beside him, her lantern swinging in a frantic arc that sent long, jagged shadows dancing across the prehistoric alcoves. She whispered that the barometric pressure was dropping so rapidly his ears might bleed. A physical manifestation of the laws of nature warping under the weight of the entity trying to anchor itself in their reality. The woman, if the term still applied, stepped fully into the flickering orange glow of the lantern. Her skin possessed the translucent, unnerving quality of fine porcelain left too long in a damp cellar, revealing a delicate web of violet veins that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Nathaniel, her voice was a breath of winter wind caught in a chimney flue, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in the hollow of his chest. He didn't move, his heavy, dragging gait forgotten as he stared into eyes that were as black and bottomless as the coal pits of the north. On the ring finger of her left hand, the gold reflected the lantern light with a cruel, mocking brilliance. Beside him, Beatrix reached into her medical bag, her fingers brushing against the cold silver of a scalpel and a pouch of iron filings, but her gaze remained fixed on the 29 figures kneeling in the dark periphery. They were a chorus of the damned, their heads bowed in a mockery of prayer, their shredded burial shrouds fluttering in a draught that shouldn't have existed this deep underground. Lord Malachi Stirling stepped out from behind a jagged basalt pillar, his evening wear pristine despite the filth of the catacombs. He looked like a man waiting for a late-night train, calm and utterly convinced of his destination. He spoke softly, his voice a soothing baritone that felt like a razor blade wrapped in velvet. He told Nathaniel that the 29 were not victims, but essential components in a grander design, a celestial alignment that required the weight of souls who had departed on this specific, sacred night. He claimed that every Christmas Eve, the boundary between the living and the ancient powers thinned to the width of a whisper, and those who died in that liminal space left behind a resonance that could be harnessed by those with the will to listen. The 29 graves opening inward was the final proof he needed. The earth itself had acted as a vacuum, pulling the dead down to provide the raw material for a return that had been centuries in the making. Malachi's voice trembled with a frantic, paternal love as he gestured toward the entity wearing Sarah's face, explaining that he had lost a daughter to the same shadow that had taken Nathaniel's wife, and that tonight the toll of 29 lives would buy back what the grave had stolen. Nathaniel's hand moved toward the heavy revolver in his coat pocket, but he knew lead was a poor argument against a grief this ancient and a madness this refined. He looked at the music box, the brass mechanism clicking as it neared the end of its spring. Beatrix hissed a warning, stating that the energy of the chamber was grounding through the silver casing of the box. She told him that if the melody reached its final note, the bridge would set like concrete, and whatever was behind that pale, beautiful mask would walk the streets of London, and the 29 vessels would follow as a silent, unholy army. Nathaniel felt the peppermint lozenge he had been sucking on dissolve into a bitter peppermint syrup in the back of his throat. He looked at the thing that looked like Sarah, and it smiled, but the expression was a mechanical approximation of joy, a mask that didn't quite fit the darkness beneath. "You were always so slow to see the patterns, Natty," the voice whispered, using a nickname that only his wife had been allowed to use in the privacy of their home. The choice solidified in Nathaniel's mind with the cold, agonizing clarity of a winter morning. He lunged forward, ignoring the white-hot scream of pain from his shattered hip. He didn't aim for Malachi or the entity. He swung the heavy metal butt of his revolver down onto the silver music box with every ounce of his remaining strength. The first strike only dented the lid, the carol skipping a beat like a dying heart. Malachi let out a choked cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated loss, and rushed forward, his manicured hands clawing at Nathaniel's throat with the strength of a drowning man. They crashed against the basalt monolith, the sharp edges of the star map, biting into Nathaniel's back. The 29 vessels rose as one, their movements synchronized and jarring, a wave of grey fabric and cold, grey flesh descending upon the center of the room. Beatrix was a whirlwind of motion, throwing handfuls of salt and iron filings, creating a temporary barrier of stinging dust that hissed and smoked when it touched the reanimated skin of the converging dead. Nathaniel struck the music box again and then a third time. On the fourth blow, the delicate brass gears inside shattered with a sound like breaking glass and the snapping of dry bone. The melody stopped instantly. For a single heartbeat, the chamber was plunged into a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight, the very silence Nathaniel had spent his entire life fearing. Then the screaming began. It wasn't Malachi, but the void itself, a sound of rushing air and collapsing stone. The entity that had worn Sarah's face began to unravel, her features blurring into a chaotic swirl of grey mist and shadow that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. The gold ring fell to the stone floor with a tiny musical chime that seemed to echo forever. The 29 vessels collapsed where they stood, their unnatural animation stripped away, leaving behind only the inert, rotting remains of people who had been forced to shoulder a burden they never asked for. Malachi Sterling fell to his knees, his face buried in his hands, as he wept for a daughter who was now truly and irrevocably gone, his grand ritual reduced to a pile of broken clockwork. The chamber began to groan, the ancient basalt cracking under the sudden release of the pent-up energy. Nathaniel grabbed Beatrix by the arm, his fingers digging into her heavy wool sleeve, and they began the arduous, limping climb back through the crumbling tunnels. They emerged into the Egyptian Avenue just as the first grey light of Christmas morning filtered through the London fog. The snow was falling now, thick and white and silent, covering the scars where the 29 graves had been swallowed by the hungry earth. Highgate Cemetery was silent once more, a city of the dead that had narrowly avoided becoming a suburb of a much darker kingdom. Hours later, Nathaniel sat in his cramped office, the smell of coal smoke and old paper, a comfort after the cloying rot of the catacombs. He held the gold ring in his palm, the metal cold and indifferent against his skin. He knew the official files on the 29 graves would be buried under layers of bureaucracy, marked as localized subsidence or a collective delusion fueled by the legendary London particular. There would be no medals for what they had done beneath the hill, and no headlines for the souls they had put back to rest. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing a man who had finally faced the silence and found that he could survive it. The mystery of the opened graves was solved, the mathematics of the occult balanced, but the hollow in his chest remained as vast as the night sky. He set the ring on his desk and watched the snow pile up against the glass, a white shroud for a city that would wake up to a Christmas it would never know it had earned through blood and peppermint. Subscribe for more cases that test your deduction skills.